Chapter 2, Part 1 of Almond-Blossom. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Almond-Blossom by Wadsley. Chapter 2, Part 1. Le cœur a des raisons que la raison ne connaît pas. Within a week, Dolores Juana Esteval, aged 2 years and 1 month, a member of the Holy Roman Church, and a citizeness of the Spanish kingdom, had become the legal possession of Tony and Francesca, and the parents of Dolores Juana had become the legal possessors of a portable bank, and felt themselves to be happily free from an encumbrance. Dolores accepted the change in her life and surroundings philosophically. She left the parental tent seated between Tony and Francesca, and Tony, Francesca noted with a little bleak smile, drove very slowly in order that Dolores might see all that there was to be seen in the way of passers-by, or flowering trees, or oxen. Francesca could have cursed and cried, laughed and derided as she sat in infinite loneliness that sunlit afternoon, and watched Tony's patience, his unaffected pleasure in Dolores' unsteady but so attractive walk, her solemn wonder at finding herself defeated by the ground she had a moment before trampled upon in triumph. He had gone with Francesca to engage a nurse, and he had talked with her in his bad, vigorous Spanish about Dolores, laughing at his mistakes, but nevertheless managing to drive home any point he wished to emphasize. As he talked, Francesca had marveled, for he knew his subject, and again at that realization a sword had turned in her heart. Dolores, her curls brushed and bobbing every moment, her cheeks carnation pink with excitement, her green eyes like clear pools lit by sheer sunshine, danced on Tony's knee, her short fluffy skirts billowing out like tiny white waves about her. The car had been requisitioned for days for her shopping. Tony had contributed a pair of emerald green shoes and a little jade necklace. "I never knew you had such decorative instincts," Francesca told him. "I haven't. Doro has such green eyes, that's all," he said with a grin. He had chosen Doro as a name, and Emilia the nurse, and Francesca had received this ultimatum with quiescence. At any rate, Francesca owned to herself, Doro paid for dressing, for the meticulous care to which she was now subjected. She was a really lovely thing, and, as Tony constantly repeated, "when she smiles," imagination was left to cope with a marvel so enchanting. As if she understood, Doro kept the smile almost exclusively for Tony. Tony was her god and sky, her need and dream. She said his name first, her only English word. She knew his voice, his step, and she swarmed up him the moment he sat down, clutching a flannelled knee in deadly seriousness, whilst she stood with both emerald-shod feet on one of Tony's, and pulled herself higher till she stood upright, gripping the lapels of his coat, her face near to his, the enchanting smile breaking out at the glorious triumph of her progress. And Tony would say under his breath, "You little ripper, you stunning little kid." He did not lavish many endearments on Doro in Francesca's hearing. He might be thick, heavy, as has been stated, but if he was also, as had been hinted by Francesca's friends, one-idea'd, sometimes that single instance of imagination was extremely tactful. Francesca and he had never discussed the question of her affection for Doro. Yet, though Francesca had been entirely sweet about getting the child things, seeing to her welfare, and though she called her "darling," Tony knew that an imitative effort on his part would not be welcome. So Doro remained unendeared in public, and Tony made up for it when he could in private. He had few chances. Francesca was generally present, but he had one amazing gorgeous afternoon when he drove Doro out alone in the car, whilst Francesca disposed, if she could, of a headache, and encouraged a siesta. Emilia pleaded to go, not that she loved the car, but that she loved Dolores. The car, in an access of self-abandonment, she had termed a machine of the evil one, having driven in it when Tony had felt inclined to pace, and having never forgotten that memorable and devastating experience. The mere idea of her beloved baby driving forth to certain danger, to her probable death, in Emilia's opinion, was not to be endured without violent protest. But Tony was adamant, and at last, having besought every saint she could remember to keep an eye on her baby, and avert the evil eye from the car, Emilia watched the rolls disappear in a cloud of dust, and returned to a broken siesta on the veranda, where, luckily, Miguel, the first waiter, was also resting from his labours, and could help to beguile sorrow from the mind by means of picked tunes played upon the mandolin, and accompanied by glances, long, expressive, and lovelorn. Tony and Dolores, meanwhile, drove together in easy silence. Dolores had on a white muslin dress, and a large white shawl which stood up in a peak at the back of her white bonnet, which was of stout corded silk, and had a ruffle round the face. "Like it?" Tony inquired at length, some 10 miles having ticked off the speedometer. He translated his speech into Dolores' native tongue, and she smiled. Tony put an arm round all the sweet whiteness, and Doro laughed. She stretched up, and laid a hand on the huge steering wheel, and laughed again. So Tony lifted her on his knee, and Doro drove. It was hot and still and peaceful, and at last, having noticed the garden, which seemed to belong to an untenanted house, Tony ran the car back, and, holding Doro on one arm, went in at the rusty iron gate to investigate. The house, a square pink-washed building, the pink faded to a pale lemon colour in many places, its black and white roof glittering in the sunshine, stood back, raised upon 2 small terraces. It appeared utterly deserted, and indeed the cobbled paths were nearly hidden beneath their growth of rank grass and groundsel. But the terraces were cascades of loveliness, from which roses tumbled in velvety waves of gorgeous deep red, and sheerest most delicate pink. Tony took out his pipe, and sat down beneath an orange tree. It was infinitely peaceful here. There seemed to be only sunshine, and the nearness of the bees and roses in the world. "We'll come here often," he said to Doro. "You and I, d'ye see? It's our enchanted garden. We discovered it." He looked gravely at Doro, who looked back with that wide, satisfying look of childhood when it loves and trusts. Tony had none of that reputed shyness, disease of mind, which is popularly supposed to beset a man at the mere nearness of a baby. He had no gêne whatever where children were concerned. To Cour he belonged to that class of men which likes children, dogs, and horses, because it understands them, a class whose adjectives are limited, but their hearts large. He was planning all sorts of things for Doro, as she industriously rolled one orange after another between his feet, white goal-posts of obliging extension, into which Doro shot with surprising regularity when she sat close to the right foot and pushed the orange with both hands. This manoeuvre Tony criticized, as became one of the sporting patrons of the British Empire. He instructed Doro in the mysteries of a foul, and urged her to shoot a little farther off, thus introducing more dash into the game. Doro agreed instantly. She sat down with a comfortable bump opposite Tony at a distance of 2 yards, and proceeded to kick off. "Good egg," Tony said judicially, when a stout orange by pure chance rolled home at last. "Keep it up, old lady." They played absorbedly, both being of that temperament which has received biblical mention in the form of an adjuration, which advice, applied to trade crises to-day, should prove of inestimable value to the output, if the workers could accept it. Doro and Tony pursued their labour with their feet in place of hands, as originally directed, but the result was satisfactory. "I'll teach you cricket later on," Tony volunteered as the game progressed, "and to ride and shoot, and above all, fish, my dear." He removed his pipe from between his teeth in order to give Doro a fair and unimpeded statement on this vital matter. "Fishin' is the sport, Doro. To go out early and stand and watch the deep swirl of quiet water, to wait and think, and then do it all over again in a world to yourself, where you can feel there's room, where you can breathe at peace. And then home in the evening through the thick soft grass, with the shadows creeping over the hills, and the smell of crushed leaves and wood fires burnin'. There's a lot in fishing, baby, take it from me." Doro apparently took it, for she said slowly and distinctly, as one repeats a hallowed word, "Fish." To Tony's ardent Waltonian soul this was sheer joy. He felt this would be an anecdote for all time, to prove conclusively the superlative wisdom of Doro, and they passed towards the car in radiant mood. Within view of the gate, Tony halted abruptly, and as he did so, a voice hailed him languidly. "Hullo, Rex, at last! I knew the car, of course. Been stalking you, as a matter of fact. Why, what?" There was a pause, during which Tony lifted Doro and walked out of the garden. He said, meeting the amused, amazed stare of the young man in the second car, "We've adopted Doro. Doro, this is your Uncle Pan." Pasquale Greville, after one swift glance at Tony's face, bent over Doro's hand and raised it with absurd empressement to his lips. As he lifted his head, he said lightly, "'Pon my soul, Rex, your taste is excellent. Congratulations indeed." Tony grunted non-committently. Then he said, "Why are you here? I thought you said in your note to Fay it was impossible to obtain leave, that you had some special stunt on?" "Oh yes, but that is quite over. The affair has died out. They always do in Madrid. We live on the verge of death by reason of our diplomatic frenzy over some detail, and behold, the next day, or at tea time the same day, it is over. This particular affair shrivelled like tissue paper in a flame. One becomes inured to an enormous expenditure of energy over nothing after a time, and remains impassive. Then one obtains leave, for the powers believe impassiveness to be exhaustion due to forced labour. I have never admired economy, but always its result." He gave a little laugh at his own words, and Tony inquired unsmilingly, "Your car?" his eyes on the scarlet racer. "Oh no, Desange lent it to me." He nodded to the chauffeur at the wheel, and told him in excellent Spanish to crank up. "You can go back to the hotel. I am returning in the other car." "See Fay at the hotel?" Tony inquired next. "No, her maid said she was asleep, but a very voluble Cordovan, with excellent teeth and pencil-line eyebrows, told me you had gone off in the car. I was rather surprised at her knowledge, knowing your views. But I see upon reflection that the girl really has a position in your menage, necessitated, one supposes, by my niece's advent." Tony said jerkily, "I rescued Doro, and we simply decided to adopt her." "Excellent idea, since she is quite beautiful." Tony thawed a little at this praise. Pasquale and he had never, as he phrased it to himself, quite hit it. Charles and he were differently bound editions of each other, but Pasquale, who was 10 years younger, and had been the only child of their father's second marriage, had never fitted into the perfect circle. Yet for the life of him Tony could not have said why he had this detached feeling about Pasquale, why Charles and he rarely talked of him, and why Pasquale seemed to lead a life apart. He had chosen to go into the diplomatic, and Madrid had been his first post. It had been at his instigation that the Rexfords had decided to motor in Spain. They had all met in Paris by chance, and Pasquale had seemed, for once, actually enthusiastic about something, and the something had been Cordova. "It has mystery, it holds the past between the dry palms of its dark hands," he had said. Tony, in his more acute moments, had wondered whether Pasquale had not the poetic instinct. Rather, let us say, he had feared this catastrophe, and always dreaded secretly to receive tangible proof thereof, especially when Pasquale enthused. Of course, it had been realized very early in the Rexford home that Pasquale as a name was impossible. The Rexford tradition, as exemplified in the 2 elder sons, decreed all things foreign to be somewhat highfalutin. As a compromise, and partly because Pasquale used the word himself, he had been nicknamed Pan. By chance, therefore, certainly from no far vision on the part of Tony or Charles, they gave their small half-brother a name whose appositeness later in his life could not be gainsaid. Another quietly mournful outlook of Tony's was concerned with Pasquale's undeniable beauty. Tony considered it almost distressing. It seemed unmanly of Pascual to be really beautiful, and odd and unnecessary that any member of decent family should be so dowered. One divine mercy alone had been vouchsafed to him in this connection. Pascual was not conceited, or at least, if he was, he had sufficient subtlety to disguise the fact. Dimly Tony realized Pascual was damn clever, and that also disquieted him. He could not fathom this brilliant-eyed, brilliant-brained young brother at all, with his deliberately exotic outlook, his barbaric strength, and his pose of extreme languidness about everyone and everything. "Comes of being foreign," Tony told himself, finding therein a balm for his own perplexity of mind. "It's his Hungarian mother." It would have been a source of comfort to Tony if Pascual's mother had been Austrian. It seemed a less remote, less wild, and altogether better country to have sprung from. She had died shortly after his father, who had idolized her, and also, true to type, idealized her too. A fortunate combination of adoration, and one which adds enormously to the comfort and peace of life for both people concerned. Tony and his stepmother had got on, inasmuch that both had tacitly and unobtrusively avoided the other. After his mother's death, Tony had made over her fortune to her son. He imagined now that Pascual's surprise visit was probably due to money shortage, but he minded that very little. He was a generous soul, and the clan protective instinct stood him in good stead here. Pascual had lifted Doro onto his knee, and was teasing her in Spanish, to which she responded with complete self-possession. Both Doro and he smiled at Tony at the same moment, and he was struck by the brilliance of their smiles, the quick flash of Pascual's golden hazel eyes, the translucent sweetness of Doro's. He found himself thinking, "What ripping children Pan'll have." Aloud he said, "Why don't you marry, Pan?" "Why should one?" Pascual answered evenly. "At 25 anyway. Vaut pas la peine, my dear." "Seems a pity not to," Tony said. "Be better for you than your type of life." Pascual made a little grimace over Doro's head. His clear-cut lips curved downwards for a moment. His eyes held a faintly contemptuous look. With that needle-like intuition of some pointed minds which goes unerringly to the very subject the listener wishes to avoid, he asked in retaliation, "How exactly does Francesca feel about Doro?" Tony bristled defensively. "How do you mean, how exactly does she feel about it?" he asked. "Oh, it occurred to me that it must be rather difficult, one would think, to accept such a condition, even when it means so lovely a thing, and not feel something. She was most awfully cut up when her accident happened, wasn't she?" Tony said rather heavily, "Fay suggested our adopting Doro." Pascual smiled again, this time with a mixture of admiration and derision. "Oh, I knew that. I was sure it would be she," he agreed lightly. They drove the rest of the way in silence. On the veranda, Francesca was waiting for them. She waved to them gaily. Pascual noticed the Cordovan girl with the pencil-line eyebrows was just behind her, and that Francesca gave her directions. He therefore was quite ready to deliver Doro into the arms held up for her, and Tony descended unencumbered from the car. End of Chapter 2, Part 1 of Almond-Blossom. Recording by Maricel Kui.